My name is Deborah Taylor, but everyone calls me Debbie. I'm 62 years old, and last Christmas, my daughter-in-law Chelsea made me sleep in the garage of my own property while she and my son Marcus hosted their annual holiday party. She handed me a sleeping bag, pointed to the oil-stained concrete floor, and said with that sweet smile of hers, "Sorry, Debbie, but we just don't have room in the house anymore. You understand, right?" What she didn't understand was that I didn't just own that house. I owned every single house on Maple Grove Drive, including the one she thought belonged to her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the small town of Millbrook, I learned early that appearances can be deceiving. My father was a quiet man who worked at the local hardware store, and my mother cleaned houses for the wealthy families on the north side of town. We lived in a modest two-bedroom rental on the outskirts, and I wore hand-me-downs from my older cousins. Nobody would have guessed that my father was slowly and methodically buying up every piece of distressed property he could find. He never talked about money, never bragged about his investments, and certainly never lived like a man who owned half the commercial district downtown. When I was 16, my father sat me down at our scratched kitchen table and spread out a collection of property deeds like he was dealing cards. "Debbie," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Money talks, but wealth whispers. The loudest people in this town usually have the least to say." He taught me that real power came from owning things that people needed, not from showing off things that people wanted. By the time I graduated high school, I understood that our family's modest lifestyle was a choice, not a necessity. After my father passed when I was 25, I inherited a portfolio that included 12 rental properties, 3 commercial buildings, and a significant stake in the local bank. My mother had always known about the investments, but she'd agreed with my father's philosophy of keeping their wealth private. "People treat you differently when they know you have money," she'd say while folding laundry in our small living room. "They either want something from you, or they resent you for having what they don't." I carried that lesson with me when I met Robert Taylor at a church social in 1985. He was a mechanic with calloused hands and an honest smile, and he never once asked me what my family did for a living. We courted for 2 years, married in a simple ceremony at the community center, and moved into a comfortable but unremarkable house on Elm Street. Robert knew I had some inherited properties, but I downplayed the extent of it. I told him I had a few rental units that helped supplement our income, which was technically true, just dramatically understated. When Marcus was born in 1987, I was determined to raise him with the same values my father had instilled in me. We lived modestly, shopped at discount stores, and taught Marcus the value of hard work. Robert ran his auto repair shop, and I managed my properties quietly, collecting rent through a property management company so tenants rarely dealt with me directly. Marcus grew up believing his mother was a part-time bookkeeper who helped local businesses with their accounting, which was another technical truth since I did manage the finances for several of my commercial tenants. Marcus was a good kid, respectful and hardworking, though perhaps a bit naive about the way the world worked. He played football in high school, earned decent grades, and after graduation, he got a job at the county clerk's office processing permits and license. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and Robert and I were proud of him for making his own way. When Marcus started dating Chelsea Williams in 2018, I was cautiously optimistic. She seemed nice enough, worked as a dental hygienist, and appeared to genuinely care about my son. Chelsea came from what she liked to call good stock, meaning her family had money and wasn't shy about displaying it. Her father owned a successful insurance agency, her mother was active in the country club social scene, and Chelsea herself drove a BMW that her parents had gifted her for her 25th birthday. During their courtship, she often made subtle comments about Marcus's potential and how he could really make something of himself with the right guidance and connections. At first, I attributed these comments to youthful enthusiasm and ambition. Chelsea was encouraging Marcus to apply for supervisor positions at work, to dress better, and to network with people who could help advance his career. There was nothing inherently wrong with wanting your partner to succeed, and I appreciated that she saw potential in my son. However, as their relationship progressed, I began to notice that Chelsea's encouragement often came with implicit criticism of Marcus's current circumstances, and by extension, the family that had raised him. The first real warning sign came during Easter dinner in Chelsea had offered to bring dessert, and she arrived with an elaborate tiramisu from an expensive bakery downtown. As we gathered around our modest dining room table, she looked around and said, "Oh, Debbie, this room has such potential. Have you ever considered updating the wallpaper? I know this great interior designer who could really transform this space." She said it with such sweetness that it took me a moment to realize she'd just insulted my home. Robert, bless his heart, didn't catch the subtle dig, but I smiled politely and said, "We like it just the way it is, dear." Chelsea nodded enthusiastically and replied, "Of course, of course. I just think it's important to invest in your environment. You know, it says so much about who you are." The implication was clear. Our environment said we were people of limited means, and perhaps, limited vision. As Marcus and Chelsea's relationship grew more serious, these small criticisms became more frequent and less subtle. She'd comment on my vintage clothing, suggest that Robert might benefit from a more modern approach to his business, and frequently mention how much better things were in her parents' neighborhood. When Marcus announced their engagement in the fall of 2019, Chelsea immediately began planning a wedding that was far beyond what I assumed their combined salaries could afford. The wedding planning process revealed another side of Chelsea's personality. She had very specific ideas about how things should be done, and those ideas invariably involved spending significant amounts of money. When I offered to help with costs, she laughed and said, "Oh, that's so sweet of you to offer. But Daddy's already covering everything. We want this to be perfect." You know, the message was clear. Their definition of perfect was beyond what Robert and I could provide. The wedding itself was a lavish affair held at the country club where Chelsea's family were members. Everything was beautiful and expensive, from the imported flowers to the 7-course dinner. Robert and I were seated at a table with some of Marcus's co-workers from the county office, while Chelsea's family and their friends occupied the tables closest to the head table. During the reception, Chelsea's mother made a point of introducing us to people as Marcus's sweet parents, in a tone that suggested we were charming but ultimately inconsequential. After the wedding, Marcus and Chelsea moved into a rental house in Millbrook's newer development on the outskirts of town. It was a nice place, much larger than the apartment Marcus had been living in, and I was happy to see him settling into married life. However, it quickly became apparent that Chelsea had plans for their lifestyle that exceeded their current income. She frequently complained about their rental situation, insisting that they needed to buy a house in a better neighborhood if they were ever going to build the kind of life she envisioned. The complaints about money became a regular theme in our family gathering. Chelsea would sigh dramatically and mention how expensive everything was, how they were struggling to save for a house down payment, and how frustrating it was to be stuck in a rental when all her friends were homeowners. She never directly asked for financial help, but the hints were constant, and increasingly less subtle. Robert, who had always been generous with Marcus, began offering to help with various expenses, but I could see that Chelsea's expectations far exceeded what we could reasonably provide without revealing the true extent of our resources. The situation came to a head in the summer of 2021 when Chelsea announced that she'd found the perfect house. It was a 4-bedroom colonial, in the prestigious Maple Grove neighborhood, the same area where I'd grown up admiring the big houses from afar. The asking price was $300,000, which was well beyond what Marcus and Chelsea could afford on their salaries, even with the raises Marcus had received at work. "We're going to need help with the down payment," Chelsea announced during a Sunday dinner at our house. She said it matter-of-factly as if it were already decided. "Daddy's willing to co-sign, but we need about $60,000 to make this work." She looked expectantly at Robert and me, clearly assuming we'd be thrilled to contribute to their dream home purchase. Robert immediately began calculating how we might be able to help, suggesting we could take out a loan against his shop or perhaps liquidate some investments. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to figure out how to make the numbers work. But something about Chelsea's presumptuous tone bothered me. She hadn't asked for help. She'd simply announced that help would be needed, and expected us to figure out how to provide it. "That's a significant amount of money," I said carefully. "Have you considered looking at something more affordable to start with?" Chelsea's expression immediately shifted from expectant to disappointed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story, and then to something approaching disdain. "Debbie," she said with exaggerated patience, "you can't build equity in a starter home. This is an investment in our future. Marcus deserves better than settling for less." The implication was that settling for less was what people like us did, and she expected more from her husband's family. Marcus, caught between his wife's expectations and his parents' apparent reluctance to immediately provide $60,000, looked uncomfortable but ultimately deferred to Chelsea. "It really is a great opportunity, Mom," he said quietly. "Houses in that neighborhood rarely come on the market." I knew this was true because I owned 4 properties on Maple Grove Drive, including the house directly across from the one Chelsea had her heart set on. In fact, I'd been the landlord for the previous tenants of Chelsea's dream house, until they'd moved out 3 months earlier. The property had been sitting empty while I decided whether to renovate it for higher-end tenants or sell it outright. Listening to Chelsea's grandiose plans for a house I actually owned was surreal, but I maintained my composed expression and simply said we'd need to think about it. Over the next few weeks, the pressure intensified. Chelsea began showing up at our house with real estate listings, renovation plans, and detailed financial projections, showing how homeownership would benefit their long-term financial health. She spoke with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, and her presentations were polished and persuasive. Robert was gradually wearing down under her persistent campaign, and I could see he was preparing to find a way to make the money available. The breaking point came when Chelsea suggested that Robert and I should consider downsizing our own home to help fund their purchase. "You two don't really need all this space," she said, gesturing around our comfortable but modest living room. "And the equity you've built up could really help Marcus get started in life." She said it as if she were doing us a favor by suggesting we disrupt our lives to fund her lifestyle upgrade. That evening, after Chelsea and Marcus had gone home, Robert and I had our first serious disagreement about money in 35 years of marriage. He couldn't understand why I was hesitant to help our son, and I couldn't explain my reluctance without revealing that $60,000 was a minor expense for us, not the major sacrifice he assumed it would be. The conversation ended with Robert sleeping in his workshop and me lying awake wondering how long I could maintain the fiction of our modest circumstance. The next morning, I drove through the Maple Grove neighborhood, past the houses I owned and the tenants I supported, thinking about Chelsea's assumptions and expectations. The house she wanted was beautiful, well-maintained, and worth every penny of the asking price. But her attitude toward my family, her presumptions about our financial capabilities, and her barely concealed disdain for our lifestyle, had crystallized something in my mind. If Chelsea wanted to live in my neighborhood, she was going to learn what it meant to actually belong there. I called my property manager that afternoon, and instructed him to list the Maple Grove house for sale. When Chelsea and Marcus called excitedly to tell us that their dream house had suddenly come on the market, I expressed appropriate surprise and enthusiasm. When they asked again about financial help, I told them Robert and I had discussed it, and decided we could contribute $25,000 toward their down payment. Enough to be helpful but not enough to make the purchase easy. Chelsea's response was immediate and revealing. $25,000 wasn't enough, she said. They needed the full $60,000 or the deal wouldn't work. She couldn't understand why we weren't willing to invest more in Marcus's future, and she began suggesting increasingly dramatic ways we could raise additional funds. Perhaps we could refinance our house, or sell Robert's boat, or ask my family for help. Each suggestion carried the implicit assumption that we owed them this opportunity, and were being unreasonably stingy by not providing it. When I gently suggested that they might need to look at less expensive options, Chelsea's mask of politeness finally slipped completely. "I don't understand you, Debbie," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "Marcus is your only child. Don't you want him to have nice things? Don't you want him to succeed?" The subtext was clear. If we truly loved Marcus, we'd find a way to give Chelsea what she wanted. That conversation convinced me that Chelsea's vision of success was entirely material, and that her love for Marcus was conditional on his ability to provide the lifestyle she felt she deserved. More troubling was the realization that Marcus was beginning to adopt her perspective, viewing his parents' reluctance to fund their dreams as evidence that we didn't believe in his potential. 3 weeks later, Chelsea called with exciting news. Her father had agreed to provide the additional $35,000 they needed, making their offer competitive and enabling them to proceed with the purchase. She was triumphant and just a little smug, having proved that someone in the family was willing to prioritize Marcus's success. The closing was scheduled for mid-September, and Chelsea immediately began making plans for their new life in the prestigious neighborhood. I congratulated them warmly and offered to help with the moving process, an offer that Chelsea graciously accepted while making it clear that she had very specific ideas about how things should be done. She'd already hired professional movers for the furniture and fragile items, but she thought it would be nice if Robert and I could handle some of the smaller boxes and cleaning supplies. It was, she explained, a way for us to feel involved in their exciting transition. Moving day arrived with Chelsea in full organizational mode, directing traffic and ensuring that every detail met her exacting standards. She'd prepared a color-coded schedule showing when each room would be packed, loaded, and unpacked, and she treated the entire process like a military operation. Robert and I dutifully carried boxes and cleaning supplies, receiving instructions and corrections from Chelsea as she supervised our contributions to her grand vision. The house itself was beautiful, exactly as I remembered it from my last inspection 6 months earlier. Chelsea walked through each room like a queen surveying her domain, pointing out features and discussing her renovation plans with anyone who would listen. She was particularly excited about the master bedroom, which had a walk-in closet and en-suite bathroom that she declared perfect for entertaining guests. As the afternoon wore on, Chelsea's comments became increasingly pointed about the differences between their new lifestyle and the one Marcus had grown up with. She made several remarks about how nice it would be to finally have space for dinner parties, to live somewhere that reflected their values, and to be part of a community where people understood the importance of maintaining standards. Each comment was technically about their new house, but the implications about our family's shortcomings were unmistakable. The final straw came during the housewarming party Chelsea organized 2 weeks after moving in. She'd invited Marcus's coworkers, her friends from the dental office, and several neighbors from Maple Grove Drive. Robert and I were invited, but it was clear we were expected to play the role of proud but humble parents, grateful to see our son doing so well for himself. The party was elegant and well executed, with catered appetizers and professional floral arrangements throughout the house. Chelsea played the perfect hostess, introducing guests to each room, and highlighting the features that made their new home so special. When people asked about the house's history, she mentioned that it had been a rental property but had been beautifully maintained, and was now finally getting the attention it deserved from owners who truly appreciated its potential. At one point during the evening, I overheard Chelsea talking to one of their new neighbors about the previous tenants. "Thank goodness they're gone," she said with a laugh. "You know how renters can be. They never really take care of a place the way owners do." The neighbor nodded sympathetically and mentioned that she hoped the area wouldn't become too transient with rental properties bringing down property values. "Oh, that won't be a problem," Chelsea replied confidently. "This whole neighborhood is moving toward homeownership. I can't imagine anyone would want to keep rental properties here when they could sell to families who really care about the community." She gestured around the room as if to illustrate her point about people who truly belonged in such a setting. I excused myself from the conversation I'd been having with one of Marcus's coworkers, and stepped out onto the back patio for some air. The irony of Chelsea's comments wasn't lost on me. She was celebrating her ownership of a house I'd sold to her while simultaneously dismissing the rental properties that provided the foundation for her new neighborhood's character and stability. More significantly, she was making assumptions about community ownership and property values that demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of how the local real estate market actually worked. The party concluded with Chelsea thanking everyone for helping them celebrate their new beginning. She made a particular point of acknowledging her father's generosity in making their dream possible, and she expressed hope that their new home would be the foundation for the kind of life she and Marcus had always envisioned together. Robert and I were thanked for our support, but it was clearly an afterthought, a polite acknowledgement of our peripheral role in their success story. During the drive home, Robert was enthusiastic about the party and proud of how well Marcus and Chelsea were settling into their new life. He pointed out how happy Marcus seemed and how impressed the guests had been with their home. I nodded and made appropriate responses, but privately I was reflecting on the evening's revelations about Chelsea's attitude toward renters, property ownership and the community she'd just joined. Over the following months, this attitude became more pronounced and problematic. Chelsea began attending neighborhood association meetings, and quickly established herself as an advocate for policies that would discourage rental properties and prioritize homeowners' interests. She pushed for stricter maintenance standards, higher fees for non-owner-occupied properties, and zoning changes that would make it more difficult to operate rental units in the area. Her efforts were well-intentioned from her perspective, but they demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the neighborhood's economic dynamics. Maple Grove Drive's stability and property values were supported by a careful balance of owner-occupied homes and well-maintained rental property. The rental income allowed property owners to invest in maintenance and improvements that benefited the entire community, while providing housing options for young professionals and families who weren't ready to purchase homes. Chelsea's campaign against rental properties was gaining support from some newer residents who shared her vision of an exclusively owner-occupied neighborhood. She organized petition drives, lobbied the city council, and even started a blog documenting what she called the rental problem in prestigious neighborhoods. Her writing was persuasive and passionate, but it was based on assumptions rather than actual knowledge of local property ownership patterns. The situation became personal during Thanksgiving 2021 when Chelsea used our family dinner as an opportunity to discuss her neighborhood activism. She was excited about a recent victory in getting the city to increase licensing fees for rental properties, and she spoke enthusiastically about her plans to clean up Maple Grove Drive by encouraging more families to purchase rather than rent. "It's really about community stability," she explained to Robert while passing the mashed potatoes. "When people own their homes, they care more about maintaining them and being good neighbors. Renters just don't have the same investment in keeping up standards." She looked directly at me while making this point, as if expecting agreement or perhaps acknowledgement that our family's modest circumstances made us natural allies in her fight against transient residents. I asked what she knew about the actual property owners in her neighborhood, wondering if she'd done any research into who was making the rental decisions she opposed. Chelsea admitted she didn't know most of the landlords personally, but she'd heard that many of them were absentee owners who didn't live locally and therefore didn't understand the community's needs and values. "That's the problem with rental properties," she continued. "The people making money from them don't have to live with the consequences of their decisions. They just collect rent checks without caring about how their properties affect property values and neighborhood character." Her tone suggested that such people were fundamentally different from responsible homeowners like herself, people who understood the importance of community standards and long-term investment. Robert nodded along with Chelsea's reasoning, and even Marcus seemed convinced by her arguments about community stability and property values. I found myself in the uncomfortable position of listening to my daughter-in-law advocate for policies that would directly impact my business and financial well-being, while simultaneously criticizing people exactly like me for their supposedly irresponsible approach to property ownership. After dinner, while Chelsea and Marcus were showing Robert some renovation plans for their kitchen, I stepped outside and called my property manager. I instructed him to begin preparing reports on all my Maple Grove properties, including maintenance records, tenant histories, and financial impacts on the local community. If Chelsea wanted to wage war against rental properties in my neighborhood, she was going to discover exactly who she was fighting. The confrontation I'd been anticipating finally came in December 2020. Marcus called on a Tuesday afternoon, sounding stressed and apologetic. Chelsea's father had experienced some financial setbacks with his insurance business, and they were going to need help making their mortgage payments until he could recover. The down payment assistance he'd provided had been structured as a loan, and he was now calling it in to address his own cash flow problems. "We're not asking for charity," Marcus said quickly. "We just need a bridge loan, maybe $15,000, just until we can refinance or Chelsea's dad gets back on his feet." He sounded embarrassed but determined, and I could tell this conversation was difficult for him. I asked how long they thought they'd need assistance, and Marcus admitted he wasn't sure. Chelsea's father's problems were more serious than they'd initially understood, and it might be several months before he could honor his original commitment to help with their housing expenses. In the meantime, their mortgage payment was more than half of Marcus's salary, and Chelsea's income as a dental hygienist wasn't enough to cover the shortfall. When I suggested they might need to consider selling the house and finding something more affordable, Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Chelsea doesn't think that's necessary. She thinks we just need to get through this rough patch, and everything will work out." The way he said it suggested this was Chelsea's position, not necessarily his own assessment of their situation. I told Marcus I'd need to discuss it with Robert, and we'd get back to him within a few days. That evening, Robert and I had another difficult conversation about how much help we should provide and what we could reasonably afford. Robert was inclined to give them whatever they needed, arguing that family should support family during difficult times. I agreed with the principle but questioned whether we were actually helping Marcus by enabling Chelsea's unrealistic expectations about their lifestyle. The conversation was complicated by the fact that I still hadn't told Robert about the full extent of our real estate holding. He knew I owned several rental properties, but he assumed they were modest investments that provided supplemental income rather than the substantial portfolio they actually represented. Explaining why I was hesitant to provide $15,000 would require revelations I wasn't prepared to make. We eventually agreed to offer Marcus a loan rather than a gift, with reasonable terms and a clear repayment schedule. When I called him back to explain our decision, Marcus was grateful but also seemed concerned about how Chelsea would react to the loan structure. She was kind of hoping for something more like what her dad provided, he said carefully. "You know, more flexible terms." I explained that Robert and I needed to protect our own financial stability, and that a formal loan was the most responsible approach for everyone involved. Marcus accepted this reasoning, but I could tell he was dreading the conversation with Chelsea about our conditions and expectations. The loan papers were signed in our kitchen on a cold Saturday morning in January 20. Chelsea was polite but clearly disappointed with the arrangement, and she made several comments about how different families had different approaches to supporting their children. She signed the documents with obvious reluctance, and I could see her calculating how quickly they could pay off the debt and free themselves from obligation to Robert and me. "This is really generous of you," she said with forced enthusiasm. "I know 15,000 is probably a lot for you guys." The comment was ostensibly grateful, but it carried an undertone suggesting that our family's financial limitations made even this modest assistance a significant sacrifice. I simply smiled and said we were happy to help Marcus during a difficult time. Over the next few months, the loan payments became a source of increasing tension. Chelsea clearly resented the monthly reminder of their dependence on Robert and me, and she began making comments about how the debt was preventing them from making necessary improvements to their home. She spoke often about how much better their financial situation would be once her father recovered, and they could pay us back. The situation deteriorated further when Chelsea's neighborhood activism began affecting Marcus's work at the county office. As part of her campaign against rental properties, she'd been filing complaints and requesting inspections that required processing by Marcus's department. His colleagues began joking about his wife's crusade against landlords, and his supervisor mentioned that the increased paperwork was becoming a burden on their office. Marcus found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to process his wife's complaints against property owners while trying to maintain professional neutrality. When I asked him how he felt about Chelsea's activism, he said he supported her goals but wished she would work through different channels. It was clear that he was beginning to understand the broader implications of her campaign, even if he wasn't ready to openly oppose her efforts. The breaking point came in March 2022, when Chelsea decided to escalate her campaign by organizing a public meeting about the rental crisis in prestigious neighborhoods. She'd invited city council members, local real estate agents, and affected homeowners to discuss policy solutions and community action. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the community center, and Chelsea had been promoting it through social media and neighborhood flyers for weeks. I attended the meeting as a concerned resident, sitting in the back row and listening as Chelsea presented her research and recommendations. She'd prepared a detailed presentation about property values, community stability, and the negative impacts of rental properties on neighborhood character. Her arguments were passionate and well organized, and several attendees expressed support for her proposed solutions. During the question and answer period, a woman I didn't recognize asked about the actual property owners in the affected neighborhood. She wanted to know whether Chelsea had spoken with any landlords about their perspective on the issues she'd raised. Chelsea admitted she hadn't contacted property owners directly, explaining that she preferred to work through official channels rather than trying to negotiate with people whose interests were fundamentally opposed to community welfare. Besides, Chelsea added, most of these properties are owned by people who don't live here and don't understand our community. They're just collecting rent checks without caring about the impact on families who are trying to build something permanent. The audience nodded sympathetically, and several people shared their own stories about problematic rental properties and absent landlords. I raised my hand during the final questions and asked whether Chelsea had considered the possibility that some local property owners might be responsive to community concerns if they were approached respectfully. I suggested that dialogue might be more effective than adversarial policies, and that property owners who lived in the area might have different perspectives than absentee landlords. Chelsea's response was polite but dismissive. I appreciate that perspective, she said. But our experience has been that property owners are primarily motivated by profit rather than community welfare. We need policies that protect homeowners' interests regardless of whether landlords choose to cooperate. Her tone suggested that anyone who advocated for property owners' perspectives was either naive or had ulterior motives. After the meeting, I approached Chelsea to congratulate her on a well-organized presentation. She was surrounded by supporters and clearly energized by the positive response to her proposals. When I mentioned that I lived in the area and was interested in her research, she launched into an enthusiastic explanation of her plans for the next phase of her campaign. We're going to start documenting every violation and complaint in rental properties, she said excitedly. Then we'll present the evidence to the city council and demand action. These landlords think they can ignore community standards because nobody's paying attention. But that's about to change. She spoke with the confidence of someone who believed she'd identified a clear problem with an obvious solution. I asked whether she'd had any direct communication with property owners about her concerns, and Chelsea shook her head. Why would I waste time talking to people who have already shown they don't care about our community? Their actions speak louder than any promises they might make. She seemed genuinely puzzled by the suggestion that property owners might be reasonable people who could be engaged constructively. That conversation confirmed my growing certainty that Chelsea viewed the world in stark terms, with responsible homeowners on one side and irresponsible landlords on the other. She'd constructed a narrative that cast herself as a community advocate, fighting against faceless property owners who threatened everything she valued about her neighborhood. The possibility that some of those property owners might be neighbors, friends, or even family members had never occurred to her. Over the next few weeks, Chelsea's campaign gained momentum and media attention. A local newspaper wrote a sympathetic article about her efforts to preserve neighborhood character, and she was invited to speak at a regional conference about housing policy and community development. She was becoming a recognized voice on rental property issues, and her confidence in her position was growing stronger with each public appearance. The irony of the situation was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Chelsea was building her reputation as an advocate for homeowners' rights while living in a house she'd purchased from me, and making loan payments to fund a lifestyle she couldn't actually afford. She was campaigning against rental properties while benefiting from the financial stability that rental income provided to property owners like me. Most significantly, she was attacking the integrity and community commitment of people she'd never met, while taking for granted the support and generosity of family members whose resources she didn't understand. I realized that the time for passive observation was ending. Chelsea's campaign was gaining enough momentum to actually affect local policy, and her public statements about property owners were becoming increasingly inflammatory and personal. If she wanted to declare war on rental properties in my neighborhood, She was going to learn exactly who she was fighting and what the consequences of that fight might. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal not only the extent of my property holdings, but also the fundamental assumptions Chelsea had made about power, community, and family. She'd spent months positioning herself as David, fighting against Goliath. But she was about to discover that sometimes Goliath has been standing quietly in the background, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. The breaking point arrived on a humid Thursday evening in June 2022, when Chelsea knocked on our front door with a manila folder tucked under her arm, and an expression that could only be described as triumphant. She'd been working on what she called Phase 2 of her rental property campaign, which involved creating detailed profiles of problematic landlords in the area. Robert and I invited her in for iced tea, expecting another update on her neighborhood activism, but what she presented that evening went far beyond anything she'd shared before. "I've been doing some research," Chelsea announced, settling into our living room with the confidence of someone who believed she'd uncovered something significant. "And I've discovered that one property owner is responsible for most of the rental problems in our neighborhood." She opened her folder and spread out what appeared to be property records, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes across our coffee table. According to Chelsea's research, someone named Taylor owned 4 properties on Maple Grove Drive, including several that had experienced what she called rapid tenant turnover and maintenance issues. She'd compiled a list of complaints filed against these properties over the past 3 years, along with photographs of minor violations like overgrown landscaping and delayed repairs. "The worst part," Chelsea continued, clearly energized by her detective work, "is that this person doesn't even live in our neighborhood. They're probably some investor from out of state who sees our community as nothing more than a source of passive income." She pointed to the property records, which listed my business address rather than my home address as the owner contact information. Robert leaned forward to examine the documents, and I could see him trying to process what Chelsea was showing us. The properties she'd identified were indeed mine, though she'd only discovered 4 of the 6 I actually owned on Maple Grove Drive. Her research was thorough but incomplete, and her conclusions about my motivations and character were based entirely on assumptions rather than fact. "What exactly are you planning to do with this information?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral while studying the photographs she'd taken of my property. Most of the violations she'd documented were minor issues that had already been addressed, but she'd clearly spent considerable time building her case against this mysterious landlord. Chelsea's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "I'm going to expose them," she said simply. "I'm organizing a public campaign to put pressure on D. Taylor to either improve their properties or sell them to families who will actually care about our neighborhood." She explained that she'd already contacted local media outlets and was planning to present her findings at the next city council meeting. "People have a right to know who's making money off our community while contributing nothing to its stability," she declared. "This Taylor person thinks they can hide behind business addresses and property management companies, but I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly how their greed is affecting our quality of life." I asked whether she'd tried contacting the property owner directly to discuss her concerns before launching a public campaign. Chelsea shook her head dismissively. "Why would I waste time trying to reason with someone who's already shown they don't care about our community? Besides, people like this only respond to public pressure and bad publicity." Robert was studying the property records more carefully now, and I could see recognition beginning to dawn in his expression. The business address Chelsea had identified was the same one I used for my property management company, and the initials D. Taylor clearly referred to Deborah Taylor. He looked at me with confusion and growing understanding, but said nothing while Chelsea continued her presentation. "The really infuriating part," Chelsea went on, "is that this person probably makes more money from these 4 properties than Marcus and I earn combined, but they can't be bothered to maintain them properly or screen tenants carefully." She showed us a photograph of peeling paint on one property's back fence, taken from the alley behind the house. "Marcus works hard every day at a real job that contributes to our community," she said, her voice rising with indignation. "Meanwhile, people like Taylor just collect rent checks while our neighborhood deteriorates around their neglected properties." The irony of her statement wasn't lost on me, considering that Marcus's real job processing permits was partially funded by the taxes I paid on those same properties. I excused myself to get more iced tea, needing a moment to process what I'd just heard and decide how to respond. In the kitchen, I could hear Chelsea explaining to Robert how she planned to organize a neighborhood boycott of businesses that worked with problem landlords. She'd apparently researched the property management company I used, and was planning to target them as collaborators in what she called the exploitation of our community. When I returned to the living room, Robert was asking Chelsea whether she thought it was fair to attack someone without giving them a chance to respond to her accusation. His question was careful and diplomatic, but I could see he was struggling with the knowledge that his daughter-in-law was unknowingly declaring war on his wife. "Sometimes you have to fight fire with fire," Chelsea replied firmly. "These investors count on people being too polite to call them out publicly. Well, I'm not going to be polite anymore when it comes to protecting our neighborhood and our property value." She gathered her documents with the satisfaction of someone who believed she'd recruited allies for her cause. After Chelsea left that evening, Robert and I sat in our living room staring at each other in stunned silence. Finally Robert spoke. "Debbie, those are your properties she's talking about, aren't they?" His voice was quiet, but I could hear the confusion and concern beneath his calm tone. I nodded, feeling the weight of years of maintained secrecy settling between us. "Yes, they are. And there are 2 more she hasn't identified yet." Robert absorbed this information without immediately responding, and I could see him recalculating everything he thought he knew about our financial situation and my business activities. "How long have you owned them?" he asked finally. I explained that I'd inherited 2 of the properties from my father and had purchased the others over the years as they became available. The rental income had been substantial enough to allow us to live comfortably while maintaining the modest lifestyle we'd both prefer. Robert was quiet for several minutes, processing not only the revelation about my property holdings, but also the implications of Chelsea's campaign against me. "She's going to be humiliated when she finds out," he said eventually. "And Marcus is going to be caught in the middle of something he doesn't understand." I agreed that the situation was becoming untenable, but I wasn't sure how to address it without causing even more family drama. Chelsea had invested considerable time and energy in building her case against the mysterious Deborah Taylor, and discovering that her enemy was actually her mother-in-law would undermine everything she'd worked toward. "Maybe you should just tell her," Robert suggested. "Sit her down, explain the situation, and give her a chance to adjust her approach before she makes this public." His optimism about Chelsea's potential reasonableness was touching, but I wasn't convinced she'd be willing to abandon her crusade, simply because it was inconvenient for family relationships. Over the next few days I considered various approaches to resolving the situation. I could reveal my identity as the property owner and deal with the immediate fallout, or I could continue maintaining my anonymity and let Chelsea proceed with her campaign. Neither option seemed likely to preserve family harmony, but I was increasingly convinced that silence was no longer sustainable. The decision was made for me when Marcus called on Sunday afternoon, sounding stressed and confused. "Mom, Chelsea's been showing me some research she's done about rental properties in our neighborhood, and some of the details seem familiar." He paused, and I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "The business address she found for one of the property owners is the same one you use for your bookkeeping client." I asked what Chelsea had told him about her research, and Marcus explained that she'd been working late every night for the past week, preparing what she called the most important presentation of her life. She'd apparently scheduled meetings with 3 city council members and had been promised coverage by the local newspaper for her upcoming exposé of neighborhood slumlords. "She keeps talking about this D. Taylor person like they're some kind of criminal," Marcus continued. "But Mom, Taylor isn't you, is it?" The question hung in the air between us, and I could hear that he already suspected the answer. I confirmed that I was indeed the Taylor whose properties Chelsea had been investigating, and I explained briefly about the inheritance from my father and the investments I'd made over the years. Marcus was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was strained. "Oh God, Mom. She's planning to destroy you publicly. She's got photographs, complaint records, everything. She thinks she's going to be some kind of hero for exposing you." He sounded genuinely distressed, caught between loyalty to his wife and horror at what she was unknowingly planning to do to his mother. I asked Marcus what he thought we should do, and he admitted he didn't know. Chelsea had been so passionate about her research that he'd been afraid to question her conclusions or methods. He'd assumed she knew what she was doing, and that her targets deserved whatever public scrutiny they received. "I can't let her humiliate you like this," Marcus said finally, "but I don't know how to stop her without admitting that I knew who Deborah Taylor was and didn't warn her." The complexity of his position wasn't lost on me. He was facing the choice between protecting his mother and supporting his wife's crusade, with no option that wouldn't damage one of those relationships. We agreed that I would need to reveal my identity to Chelsea before her planned presentation, but we disagreed about how and when that conversation should happen. Marcus wanted to tell her himself, believing that the news would be easier for her to accept coming from him. I preferred to handle the conversation directly, feeling that Chelsea deserved to hear the truth from the person she'd been attacking. Our discussion was interrupted when Marcus received a text message from Chelsea asking him to come home immediately. She'd apparently received confirmation that the city council would give her 15 minutes during their Thursday meeting to present her findings about problem landlords. She was excited and wanted to practice her presentation with Marcus as her audience. "I have to go," Marcus said reluctantly. "But Mom, please don't do anything until we can figure out the best way to handle this." I promised to wait, but privately I was beginning to think that allowing Chelsea to continue her preparations would only make the eventual revelation more painful for everyone involved. That evening, while Robert watched television in his workshop, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the documents Chelsea had shown us. Her research was impressively thorough, even if her conclusions were based on incomplete information. She'd identified genuine maintenance issues that needed attention, documented legitimate tenant complaints, and compiled a persuasive case for increased oversight of rental properties. The problem wasn't that Chelsea was wrong about everything. Some of her criticisms were valid, and her passion for community improvement was admirable. The problem was that she'd approached the situation as a crusade against faceless enemies, rather than as an opportunity for constructive dialogue with community stakeholders. I found myself wondering whether Chelsea's attitude would have been different if she'd known from the beginning that one of the neighborhood's largest property owners was someone she knew personally. Would she have been more inclined toward collaboration if she'd understood that her success in improving rental properties could benefit her own family? Or would she have seen my property ownership as a betrayal of trust and confirmation that people couldn't be relied upon to prioritize community welfare over personal profit? The next morning, I drove through Maple Grove Drive, looking at my properties through Chelsea's eyes, and trying to understand her perspective. The house she and Marcus lived in was indeed well-maintained and beautiful, but it wasn't significantly different from the rental properties she was criticizing. The tenants in my other properties were professionals and young families who took good care of their homes and contributed positively to the neighborhood's character. I stopped at the property where Chelsea had photographed the peeling fence paint and examined the issue firsthand. The fence needed attention, but it wasn't the egregious violation she'd portrayed in her documentation. A call to my property manager confirmed that the repair had already been scheduled, but the tenant had requested that the work be delayed until after their daughter's graduation party the following weekend. Similar investigation of Chelsea's other documented violations revealed a pattern of minor issues that were being addressed through normal maintenance procedures. Her photographs captured problems at their worst moments, before repairs were completed, creating an impression of systematic neglect that didn't reflect the actual condition of the properties. I realized that Chelsea's campaign wasn't really about property maintenance or tenant screening. It was about control and community identity. She wanted to live in a neighborhood where people like her made decisions about what was acceptable and who belonged. Rental properties represented unpredictability and lack of control, regardless of how well they were maintained or managed. That afternoon, I called my property manager and asked him to prepare a comprehensive report on all my Maple Grove properties, including maintenance records, tenant satisfaction surveys, and financial contributions to local community development. If Chelsea wanted to evaluate my commitment to the neighborhood, she should have access to complete information rather than selective documentation. I also scheduled individual meetings with my current tenants, something I hadn't done in years. If Chelsea was going to present herself as a voice for community welfare, I wanted to understand how the people actually living in my properties viewed their housing situation and their role in the neighborhood. The conversations with my tenants were enlightening and encouraging. The family renting the house across from Chelsea had been looking to purchase in the area, but appreciated the flexibility of renting while they saved for a down payment. The young professional in the renovated Colonial was completing a medical residency and would be relocating in 2 years for a fellowship program. The retired couple in the smaller Cape had downsized from homeownership and preferred renting for the reduced maintenance responsibility. All of my tenants spoke positively about their experience with the properties and their relationship with the property management company. Several mentioned specific improvements that had been made during their tenancy, and none reported the kinds of problems Chelsea had documented in her research. They were engaged community members who participated in neighborhood activities and maintained their properties as carefully as any homeowner. Armed with this information, I felt more confident about confronting Chelsea's accusations directly. Her campaign was based on stereotypes and assumptions, rather than actual knowledge of how rental properties functioned in the neighborhood. If she wanted to position herself as a community advocate, she needed to understand the full complexity of the housing market and the diverse needs of neighborhood residents. The confrontation I'd been anticipating came sooner than expected when Chelsea appeared at our front door on Tuesday evening, clearly agitated and clutching her phone. Without waiting for an invitation, she pushed past Robert and announced that she'd received disturbing information about the Taylor investigation. "Someone's been interfering with my research," she declared, pacing around our living room with obvious frustration. I called to schedule property inspections for Thursday's presentation, and the city clerk told me that Taylor had already requested meetings with all the tenants this week. She stopped pacing and looked directly at me. "How did they know about my presentation?" "Someone must have warned them." I asked what she planned to do about this development, and Chelsea's response revealed the depth of her paranoia about the situation. She was convinced that Taylor had connections within the city government, who were providing inside information about her campaign. She'd already contacted the newspaper to suggest that their story should focus on corruption and insider manipulation rather than just property violations. "This proves exactly what I've been saying," Chelsea continued, her voice rising with excitement. "These people think they can use their connections and money to avoid accountability, but I'm not going to let that happen." She explained that she'd decided to move her presentation to the very next day, hoping to catch the mysterious property owner off guard before they could mount a defense. Robert and I exchanged glances, both recognizing that the situation was spiraling beyond our ability to manage it quietly. Chelsea was so invested in her narrative of corruption and conspiracy that revealing my identity would likely confirm her worst suspicions rather than encouraging reasonable dialogue. "Chelsea," I said carefully, "what if this Taylor person isn't what you think they are? What if there's a reasonable explanation for everything you've discovered?" My question was intended to open a path toward revelation, but Chelsea's response showed how deeply committed she was to her adversarial approach. "Debbie, I appreciate your optimism, but some people can't be reasoned with," she replied with patronizing patience. Taylor has had years to be a responsible property owner, and instead they've chosen to prioritize profits over community welfare. Now they're trying to use political connections to avoid consequences, which proves they know exactly what they've been doing wrong. She pulled out her phone and showed us a text message she'd received from an unknown number asking her to delay her presentation until after a scheduled meeting with the property owner. Chelsea was convinced this was an intimidation tactic designed to discourage her from proceeding with her campaign. "Who do they think they're dealing with?" she asked rhetorically. "I'm not some naive little housewife they can scare into silence. I've done my research, I have evidence, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth about what's been happening in our neighborhood." The text message she'd shown us was actually from my property manager, who'd been trying to arrange a meeting to address her concerns before they became a public issue. But Chelsea had interpreted the communication as confirmation that she was dealing with powerful enemies who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. At that moment, I realized that no amount of explanation or evidence would change Chelsea's mind about the situation. She'd constructed a narrative that cast her as a heroic whistleblower fighting against corrupt landlords and their political allies. Revealing that her primary target was actually her mother-in-law would require her to completely reimagine her understanding of the situation, something she was clearly not prepared to do. Robert tried a different approach, asking Chelsea whether she'd considered the possibility that publicly attacking property owners might have unintended consequences for the neighborhood. What if her campaign discouraged investment in rental properties, leading to fewer housing options for young families and professionals? Chelsea's response was immediate and dismissive. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that got us into this mess," she said. "People prioritizing property values and investment returns over community stability and family welfare." She looked directly at Robert while making this point, clearly frustrated that he wasn't more supportive of her effort. "Besides," she continued, "Marcus and I represent the future of this neighborhood. We're the kind of people who should be making decisions about what's best for our community, not some mysterious investor who probably doesn't even know our street name." Her sense of entitlement was breathtaking, but it also revealed the fundamental assumptions underlying her entire campaign. I excused myself from the conversation, ostensibly to check on dinner preparations, but actually to call Marcus and warn him about what was happening. When he answered, I could hear Chelsea's voice in the background, apparently practicing her presentation for the next day's city council meeting. "Marcus, she's moved the presentation to tomorrow," I said quietly, "and she's convinced herself that I'm part of some conspiracy to silence her. This is going to be a disaster for everyone if she goes through with it." I could hear the strain in my own voice as I contemplated the public humiliation that awaited us all. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then said, "Mom, I have to tell her tonight. I can't let her walk into that meeting without knowing who she's really attacking." His voice was resolved but sad, and I could tell he understood that his marriage was about to face a crisis that might not be survivable. "Are you sure you want to handle it alone?" I asked. "This affects all of us, and maybe it would be better if we told her together." But Marcus was firm in his decision to speak with Chelsea privately, before involving anyone else in the conversation. We agreed that he would call me after talking with Chelsea regardless of how late it might be. I spent the rest of the evening trying to prepare myself for whatever fallout would result from Marcus's revelation. Robert and I discussed various scenarios and responses, but neither of us felt confident about how Chelsea would react to learning the truth. The call came at 11:30 that night. Marcus's voice was strained and exhausted as he described his conversation with Chelsea. Initially, she'd refused to believe that I was the Deborah Taylor she'd been investigating. When Marcus showed her documentation proving the connection, she'd accused him of conspiring with me to undermine her campaign. "She thinks this is all some elaborate setup," Marcus said wearily. "She's convinced that you knew about her research from the beginning, and that I've been reporting back to you about her plans." The paranoia that had driven Chelsea's investigation was now being turned against her own family. According to Marcus, Chelsea had spent most of their conversation trying to understand why I hadn't revealed my property ownership earlier. She interpreted my silence as evidence of guilt rather than an attempt to avoid family conflict. In her mind, innocent people didn't hide their business activities from their families. "She wants to meet with you tomorrow morning," Marcus continued, "before the city council meeting. She says she needs to hear your side of the story before she decides how to proceed." His tone suggested that he wasn't optimistic about the outcome of such a meeting, but he'd agreed to arrange it in hopes of preventing a public confrontation. I agreed to meet with Chelsea, though I wasn't convinced that private conversation would be any more productive than our previous interactions. She'd invested so much time and energy in building her case against the mysterious Taylor that acknowledging my legitimacy as a property owner would require her to admit that her entire campaign had been based on misunderstandings and assumptions. That night, I lay awake considering what I would say to Chelsea and how I might help her understand my perspective without completely destroying her sense of purpose and accomplishment. She'd genuinely tried to improve her community, even if her methods had been misguided. The challenge would be finding a way to redirect her energy toward constructive collaboration rather than adversarial confrontation. The meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock the next morning at a coffee shop halfway between our houses. I arrived early and claimed a corner table where we could speak privately without being overheard by other customers. Chelsea arrived precisely on time, carrying her folder of research, and wearing an expression that could only be described as grimly determined. "I want to understand why you didn't tell me," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from me. "Marcus says you've owned those properties for years, but you never mentioned it when I was talking about rental problems in our neighborhood." Her tone was controlled but accusatory, and I could see that she'd spent considerable time preparing for this confrontation. I explained that I'd initially remained silent to avoid family conflict and that I'd continued maintaining my anonymity as her campaign became more aggressive and personal. I told her about my father's philosophy regarding wealth and privacy, and how I'd tried to honor his example by keeping my business activities separate from my family relationships. Chelsea listened to my explanation without interrupting, but her expression remained skeptical throughout. When I finished, she asked, "So you've been sitting there for months, listening to me talk about problem landlords, knowing that I was actually talking about you?" Her voice carried a mix of hurt and anger that suggested she felt personally betrayed. I acknowledged that the situation had been uncomfortable for me, but I emphasized that her research had identified real issues that deserved attention. I told her about the repairs that had been completed and the tenant satisfaction surveys that showed positive experiences with my property. I tried to frame our conversation as an opportunity for collaboration rather than confrontation. "But why should I believe anything you're telling me now?" Chelsea asked. "You've been lying to me for months. How do I know you're not just saying whatever you think will make this problem go away?" Her trust in me, which had never been strong, had apparently been completely destroyed by the revelation of my property ownership. I suggested that we could work together to address her concerns about rental properties in the neighborhood. With my knowledge of property management and her passion for community improvement, we could develop solutions that would benefit both landlords and residents. I offered to introduce her to my other tenants, so she could hear their perspectives directly. Chelsea's response revealed the depth of her disappointment and anger. "You don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice rising despite our public setting. "This isn't about fixing problems. This is about the fact that you've been deceiving me, and Marcus, about who you really are." She gathered her papers with sharp, angry movements. "I trusted you," she continued, "and you let me make a fool of myself researching and investigating and preparing presentations about problems you could have solved with a simple conversation." Her sense of betrayal was evident, and I could see that she was struggling to reconcile the mother-in-law she thought she knew with the property owner she'd been attacking. The conversation ended with Chelsea announcing that she was proceeding with her city council presentation, but that she would be modifying it to focus on the broader issue of undisclosed property ownership and family deception. She stood up from the table with obvious finality, leaving me to contemplate the ruins of our relationship and the public humiliation that awaited our entire family. As I watched her walk away, I realized that Chelsea's campaign had never really been about rental properties or community improvement. It had been about establishing her identity as someone who mattered, someone whose opinions carried weight, someone who could affect change in her environment. Discovering that her primary target was her own mother-in-law didn't resolve her concerns about community welfare. It simply revealed that the power dynamic she'd been fighting against existed within her own family. The city council chamber was more crowded than I'd expected when I arrived 15 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. Chelsea had apparently been effective in promoting her presentation, and curious neighbors filled most of the available seats. I recognized several faces from Maple Grove Drive, including two of my current tenants, who had no idea they were about to witness their landlord being publicly exposed by her own daughter-in-law. I chose a seat in the back row, hoping to remain inconspicuous while observing Chelsea's presentation and gauging the audience's response. Robert had offered to accompany me, but I'd declined, feeling that this was something I needed to face alone. Marcus was conspicuously absent, having told Chelsea that he couldn't support her presentation,
but wouldn't actively oppose it either. Chelsea entered the chamber 10 minutes later, wearing a navy blue suit that made her look professional and authoritative.
She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she was about to perform an important public service, and she nodded to several people in the audience, who had apparently come specifically to support her efforts. The first portion of the city council meeting proceeded through routine business items, while Chelsea waited for her opportunity to speak. I watched her review her notes and adjusting her presentation materials, clearly nervous but determined to follow through with her plan. When her name was finally called, she approached the podium with steady steps and began speaking in a clear, measured voice. "Good evening, council members and fellow residents," Chelsea began. "I'm here tonight to address a serious issue affecting the quality of life in our residential neighborhoods, specifically the impact of irresponsible rental property management on community stability and property values." Her opening was polished and professional, setting the tone for what she intended to be a serious policy discussion. Chelsea's presentation was indeed impressive. She used charts and photographs to illustrate her points about maintenance issues, tenant turnover, and the challenges facing homeowners in areas with significant rental property concentration. Her arguments were well organized and persuasive, and several audience members nodded in agreement as she outlined her concern. "The specific case I want to bring to your attention," Chelsea continued, "involves a property owner who controls multiple rental units in the prestigious Maple Grove neighborhood." She displayed a map showing the locations of my properties, which she'd marked with red dots to emphasize their concentration in a single area. "This individual, who operates under the name Taylor, has consistently demonstrated a pattern of reactive rather than proactive property management," Chelsea said, clicking through photographs of the minor maintenance issues she'd documented. "More troubling is their apparent unwillingness to engage with community concerns or participate in neighborhood improvement efforts." I felt a knot forming in my stomach as Chelsea built her case against me, using carefully selected evidence to paint a picture of an irresponsible absentee landlord. Her presentation was factually accurate but completely lacking in context, and I could see that the audience was becoming convinced by her arguments. "What makes this situation particularly concerning," Chelsea continued, "is that Taylor appears to be using business entities and property management companies to avoid direct accountability for their property's impact on our community." She explained that her attempts to contact the property owner directly had been unsuccessful, suggesting a deliberate strategy of avoiding community engagement. The audience was clearly engaged with Chelsea's presentation, and when she opened the floor for questions, several people shared their own experiences with problematic rental property. The discussion quickly expanded beyond my specific properties to include broader concerns about landlord accountability and tenant screening procedures. City Council member Patricia Hoffman asked Chelsea what specific policy changes she was recommending to address the issues she'd identified. Chelsea was prepared for this question and presented a detailed list of proposed regulations, including increased licensing fees for rental properties, mandatory annual inspections, and requirements for local property owner representation at community meetings. "The goal isn't to eliminate rental properties," Chelsea explained, "but to ensure that property owners are genuine community stakeholders, rather than external investors who view our neighborhoods as nothing more than sources of passive income." Her language was carefully chosen to sound reasonable and community-focused rather than adversarial. Councilmember David Chen asked whether Chelsea had attempted to resolve her concerns through direct communication with the property owners before seeking policy intervention. This question provided Chelsea with the opening she'd been waiting for to reveal what she clearly considered the most damning aspect of her case. "That's exactly the problem," Chelsea replied, her voice taking on a more emotional tone. "Taylor has deliberately avoided community engagement, using intermediaries and business addresses to maintain anonymity while collecting profits from our neighborhood." She paused dramatically before continuing. "In fact, I recently discovered that this person has been attending neighborhood meetings and community events while concealing their identity as a major property owner in our area." Chelsea, and this deception suggests a conscious decision to avoid accountability while benefiting financially from our community's stability and growth. The audience murmured with surprise and disapproval at this revelation, and I felt every eye in the room searching for the mysterious landlord who had been hiding among them. Chelsea's strategy was becoming clear. She was positioning me not just as an irresponsible property owner but as someone who had actively deceived the community about my role and interests. When I confronted Taylor about this deception, Chelsea continued, their response was to offer collaboration and dialogue, but only after being caught. This pattern of reactive engagement suggests that accountability measures must be imposed rather than requested. Her portrayal of our morning conversation was technically accurate but completely ignored the context and complexity of the situation. Councilmember Hoffman asked for more specific information about Chelsea's communication with the property owner, and Chelsea's response revealed the depth of her anger about what she viewed as my betrayal of trust. She described our family relationship without mentioning our names, presenting the situation as an example of how property ownership conflicts could poison personal relationships and community dynamics. This case demonstrates why we need clear disclosure requirements for property ownership, Chelsea argued. People have a right to know when someone in their social circle has financial interests that might conflict with community welfare. Her voice was passionate and convincing, and I could see that the audience was becoming increasingly sympathetic to her position. The discussion continued for another 20 minutes, with various community members sharing stories about rental property problems and expressing support for Chelsea's proposed solution. No one questioned her characterization of my properties or my motivations, and the narrative she'd constructed about deceptive landlords seemed to resonate with widely shared frustrations about housing and community control. When the public comment period ended, Councilmember Chen announced that the city would review Chelsea's proposals and consider them for inclusion in upcoming policy discussion. Chelsea thanked the council and the audience for their attention, clearly satisfied with the response to her presentation. As people began filing out of the chamber, I remained in my seat, processing what I'd just witnessed and considering my options for responding. Chelsea had successfully positioned herself as a community advocate fighting against deceptive property owners, and my attempt to address her concerns privately had been reframed as evidence of my guilt and manipulation. Several neighbors approached Chelsea to congratulate her on her presentation and offer support for her ongoing efforts. I recognized Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down, who had always been friendly when we encountered each other while walking our dog. She was now praising Chelsea for finally exposing the people who profit from our neighborhood, without contributing to our community. As the crowd thinned, Chelsea noticed me sitting in the back row and our eyes met across the chamber. Her expression was unreadable, but she made no attempt to approach me or acknowledge our relationship. I gathered my purse and walked toward the exit, feeling the weight of curious stares from people who had heard her presentation but didn't yet know my identity. In the parking lot, I was intercepted by Janet Morrison, a local reporter who had covered Chelsea's presentation for the weekly newspaper. She introduced herself and asked whether I had any comment on the rental property issues that had been discussed during the meeting. I think it's important for property owners and residents to work together toward solutions that benefit everyone, I said carefully, trying to avoid saying anything that could be used to further damage my reputation. Janet asked whether I was familiar with the specific properties Chelsea had discussed, and I confirmed that I knew the area well. Do you have any thoughts on the disclosure requirements that were proposed? Janet continued. Should property owners be required to identify themselves to their neighbors? Her question suggested that she was already planning to write about the policy implications of Chelsea's presentation, rather than investigating the specific claims that had been made. I told Janet that transparency was generally positive but that complex issues often required nuanced solutions rather than broad policy mandates. She thanked me for my time and mentioned that her article would appear in the next week's edition, giving the community time to consider the proposals before the next city council meeting. The drive home gave me time to reflect on what had just happened and what it meant for my relationships with Chelsea, Marcus, and the broader community. Chelsea had successfully executed her plan to expose and humiliate me, but she'd done it in a way that maintained her anonymity while leaving me vulnerable to public criticism and policy restriction. When I arrived home, Robert was waiting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and an expression of concern and sympathy. He'd been following the meeting online through the city's live stream, and he'd heard Chelsea's entire presentation without the benefit of seeing my reactions or the audience's responses. How bad was it? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I described the audience's reaction and the questions from council members, emphasizing how effectively Chelsea had controlled the narrative and positioned herself as a community advocate, rather than a disgruntled family member. "She's smart," Robert said grimly. "She found a way to attack you publicly without revealing her personal motivations or family connections." He was right that Chelsea had managed the situation strategically, but I wasn't sure whether her success would ultimately benefit her, or simply create more problems for everyone involved. The phone rang as we were discussing potential responses to Chelsea's presentation. Marcus's name appeared on the caller ID, and I answered with some trepidation about what he might have heard from Chelsea or other people who had attended the meeting. "Mom, I'm so sorry," Marcus said immediately. "I watched the live stream, and I can't believe she went through with it after everything we discussed." His voice was strained and apologetic, and I could tell that he was struggling with the conflict between loyalty to his wife and recognition that she had treated me unfairly. I asked Marcus how Chelsea had seemed when she returned home from the meeting, and he described her as satisfied but also emotionally drained. She'd apparently spent the evening responding to congratulatory messages from people who had attended or watched the presentation, positioning herself as someone who had taken a courageous stand against powerful interests. "She's convinced herself that you're the villain in this situation," Marcus continued. "She keeps talking about how you deceived our family and manipulated the community for your own benefit." He sounded exhausted by the entire situation and uncertain about how to navigate the conflict between his wife and his mother. I told Marcus that I understood his difficult position and that I didn't expect him to choose sides in what had become a very complicated family dynamic. However, I also emphasized that Chelsea's characterization of my motivations and actions was unfair and based on incomplete information about my property management practices and community involvement. "I know that, Mom," Marcus replied, "but she's not interested in hearing different perspectives right now. She's convinced that you're part of some larger problem with property ownership and community accountability." His description of Chelsea's mindset suggested that our conflict had become symbolic of broader issues, rather than a specific disagreement about rental property management. The conversation ended with Marcus promising to try to encourage Chelsea toward more reasonable dialogue, though he acknowledged that she seemed committed to pursuing policy changes rather than family reconciliation. After hanging up, Robert and I discussed whether I should attempt to respond publicly to Chelsea's accusations, or simply wait for the situation to resolve itself naturally. "The problem with staying silent," Robert pointed out, "is that people will assume her version of events is accurate." He was concerned that my reputation in the community would be permanently damaged if I didn't provide alternative information about my property management practices and community involvement. I agreed that silence might be interpreted as guilt, but I was also reluctant to escalate the conflict by engaging in public arguments with Chelsea. Any response I made would inevitably reveal our family relationship, which would shift the focus from policy issues to personal drama, and potentially damage Chelsea's credibility as a community advocate. The next morning brought the first direct consequences of Chelsea's presentation. My property manager called to report that he'd received inquiries from 3 different city departments about inspection schedules, licensing requirements, and tenant complaint procedures for my Maple Grove property. The sudden official attention was clearly a result of Chelsea's public accusations, and it would require significant time and documentation to address properly. "None of this is problematic," my property manager assured me. "Your properties are well maintained and properly licensed. But the city is obviously responding to political pressure, so we'll need to be extra thorough in our documentation and communication." He recommended scheduling voluntary inspections for all my properties to demonstrate proactive compliance with municipal standards. I also received a call from Patricia Hoffman, the city council member who had asked questions during Chelsea's presentation. She explained that the council was interested in using my properties as a case study for evaluating proposed rental property regulations, and she wanted to arrange a meeting to discuss my perspective on the issues Chelsea had raised. "We're not assuming that Williams's characterizations are accurate," Patricia clarified, but her presentation raised important questions about property owner accountability and community engagement that deserve serious consideration. Her tone was professional and neutral, suggesting that the council was approaching the situation as a policy matter, rather than a personal conflict. I agreed to meet with Patricia the following week, though I was concerned about how much detail I should provide about my family relationship with Chelsea. The meeting would give me an opportunity to correct misinformation about my properties and management practices, but it would also require me to address Chelsea's accusations about deception and community disengagement. The situation became more complicated when Janet Morrison's article appeared in the weekly newspaper 3 days after the city council meeting. Her coverage was generally fair and balanced, but it included details about Chelsea's accusations that I hadn't anticipated being made public. The article identified me by name as the D. Taylor, who owned multiple rental properties on Maple Grove Drive, and it included quotes from Chelsea's presentation about property owner accountability and community engagement. Most significantly, it mentioned that the property owner had been attending community events while concealing their financial interests in local real estate. Within hours of the article's publication, my phone began ringing with calls from neighbors, tenants, and community members, who had varying reactions to the news of my property ownership. Some calls were supportive, with people expressing surprise that I owned rental properties, but affirming their positive experiences with me as a neighbor and community member. Other calls were more critical, with callers questioning why I had never disclosed my property holdings and asking whether I had been influencing community discussions for my own financial benefit. These conversations were difficult because they required me to defend decisions I had made years earlier, based on circumstances that were no longer relevant. The most painful call came from Eleanor Hayes, an elderly neighbor who had been friendly with my mother and had known me since childhood. She expressed disappointment that I had hidden my business activities from people who considered me a friend, and she questioned whether my participation in neighborhood discussions had been genuine or calculated. "I just don't understand why you felt you needed to keep secrets from people who care about you," Eleanor said sadly. "We're not the kind of community that judges people for being successful in business." Her hurt was evident, and I realized that my decision to maintain privacy about my property ownership had been interpreted as distrust and deception by people who had no reason to expect hidden agenda. I spent considerable time that week calling people individually to explain my perspective and address their concerns about my property ownership and community involvement. These conversations were generally productive, but they required me to repeatedly justify decisions I had made for reasons that seemed less compelling in hindsight. The most challenging aspect of these discussions was explaining why I hadn't corrected Chelsea's mischaracterizations during her months-long campaign against rental property. Many people understood my desire to avoid family conflict, but they struggled with my willingness to allow misinformation to spread, rather than providing accurate information about local property management practice. My tenants were universally supportive when I contacted them to address any concerns they might have about the public attention their housing situation was receiving. Several offered to speak publicly about their positive experiences as renters, and all of them expressed appreciation for the maintenance and management services they had received over the years. Sarah Chen, the young doctor renting the Colonial across from Chelsea's house, was particularly supportive. "I've been telling people that you're the best landlord I've ever had," she said during our phone conversation. "Your property manager responds to requests immediately, and you've never made me feel like a second-class neighbor because I rent instead of own." These conversations with my tenants reinforced my conviction that Chelsea's campaign had been based on stereotypes and assumptions, rather than actual knowledge of rental property dynamics in the neighborhood. However, they also highlighted how effectively she had positioned herself as speaking for community welfare, rather than pursuing personal grievances. The meeting with council member Patricia Hoffman took place the following Tuesday morning in her office at City Hall. I brought comprehensive documentation about my properties, including maintenance records, tenant satisfaction surveys, and financial contributions to local community projects. I was prepared to address every concern Chelsea had raised and to demonstrate my genuine commitment to neighborhood welfare. Patricia began the meeting by acknowledging the complexity of the situation and emphasizing that the council's interest was in developing fair and effective rental property policies,
rather than adjudicating personal conflict. However, she also mentioned that Chelsea's presentation had raised legitimate questions about property owner transparency and community engagement that needed to be addressed. "Help me understand your perspective on the disclosure issue," Patricia said. Williams suggested that property owners should be required to identify themselves to neighbors and participate openly in community discussions. "What are your thoughts on that approach?" Her question was direct but not accusatory, and I appreciated her attempt to focus on policy implications rather than personal motivation. I explained my family's long-standing philosophy about privacy and wealth, emphasizing that my decision to maintain anonymity had been based on general principles rather than specific attempts to avoid accountability. I acknowledged that this approach had created problems in the current situation, but I argued that mandatory disclosure requirements might discourage property investment and community involvement rather than promoting them. "The irony," I continued, "is that requiring property owners to identify themselves publicly might actually reduce their willingness to participate in community activities and neighborhood discussion." I explained that many property owners might prefer to remain completely anonymous, rather than risk becoming targets for every housing-related complaint or policy disagreement. Patricia asked about my actual involvement in community activities and whether my property ownership had influenced my positions on local issues. I was able to demonstrate that my participation in neighborhood events and discussions had been genuine, and that my property interests had never led me to advocate for policies that would conflict with broader community welfare. In fact, I pointed out, many of the improvements Williams wants to see in rental properties are things I've been implementing voluntarily for years. I showed Patricia documentation of proactive maintenance, tenant screening procedures, and property upgrades that exceeded municipal requirements and demonstrated genuine investment in neighborhood quality. The conversation shifted to Chelsea's specific accusations about property management and community engagement. Patricia had clearly reviewed the documentation Chelsea had provided, and she asked pointed questions about the maintenance issues and tenant turnover that had been highlighted in the presentation. I was able to address each of Chelsea's concerns with specific information and context that she had either overlooked or deliberately omitted from her research. The peeling fence paint had been repaired within days of being reported. The tenant turnover she had documented reflected normal rental market dynamics rather than property management problems. The maintenance issues she had photographed were minor problems that had been addressed through routine procedures. "What troubles me," I told Patricia, "is that Williams developed her conclusions about my properties and my motivations without ever attempting to gather complete information or engage in direct dialogue about her concern." I emphasized that responsible policy making required accurate information and good faith communication between all stakeholders. Patricia acknowledged that Chelsea's research had been incomplete and that her presentation had relied heavily on assumptions about property owner motivations and practices. However, she also pointed out that Chelsea's broader concerns about rental property accountability and community engagement reflected legitimate issues that affected many neighborhoods beyond Maple Grove Drive. "The challenge for the council," Patricia explained, "is developing policies that address real problems without creating unnecessary burdens for responsible property owners or discouraging legitimate rental housing options." She asked for my input on specific policy proposals and my recommendations for balancing property owner rights with community welfare concerns. I spent the remainder of our meeting discussing practical approaches to rental property regulation that would promote accountability without creating adversarial relationships between property owners and neighbors. I suggested voluntary certification programs, mediation services for addressing disputes, and incentives for property owners who exceeded basic maintenance and management standards. The goal should be creating collaborative relationships between property owners and communities, I argued, rather than assuming that their interests are fundamentally opposed. I emphasized that most property owners, like most tenants and neighbors, wanted stable, attractive neighborhoods where everyone could thrive. Patricia seemed receptive to my suggestions and asked whether I would be willing to participate in a working group to develop specific policy recommendations. I agreed, though I was concerned about how my participation would be perceived, given the public controversy Chelsea had created around my property ownership. The meeting concluded with Patricia expressing appreciation for the information and perspective I had provided. She mentioned that the council would be scheduling additional discussions about rental property policies and that they would seek input from various stakeholders before making any significant regulatory changes. As I left City Hall, I felt cautiously optimistic that the policy process would be more balanced and thoughtful than Chelsea's presentation had suggested. However, I was also aware that my public reputation had been damaged and that repairing relationships within the community would require ongoing effort and patience. The drive home took me through Maple Grove Drive, past the properties that had become the center of so much controversy and conflict. The houses looked peaceful and well-maintained, with no obvious signs of the problems Chelsea had documented in her research. My tenants were going about their normal activities, contributing to the neighborhood's character and stability, just like the homeowners around them.
I stopped at the house Chelsea and Marcus lived in, the property I had sold to enable their dream of homeownership. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Chelsea was living in my former rental property while campaigning against the rental properties I still owned. She had benefited directly from my property investments while positioning herself as an opponent of property owners like me. Looking at the house, I wondered whether Chelsea understood the full implications of her campaign and whether she had considered how her success in restricting rental properties might affect other young families who needed flexible housing options. Her vision of an exclusively owner-occupied neighborhood might appeal to people who already owned homes, but it would eliminate opportunities for people who weren't ready or able to purchase. That evening, Robert and I discussed the meeting with Patricia Hoffman and the broader implications of Chelsea's campaign for our family relationships and community involvement. Robert was encouraged by Patricia's receptiveness to alternative perspectives, but he remained concerned about the long-term damage to our reputation and social connections. The problem isn't what you did or didn't do with your properties, Robert observed. The problem is that Chelsea has created a narrative where you're either the villain or the victim, and neither role is accurate or fair. He was right that the situation had been simplified in ways that didn't reflect the complexity of property ownership, community dynamics, or family relationship. We also discussed whether I should attempt to repair my relationship with Chelsea or simply accept that our conflict might be permanent. Robert was optimistic that time and reflection might help Chelsea understand my perspective, but I was less confident that she would be willing to acknowledge the problems with her approach or the unfairness of her accusations. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at our front door. When I answered, I found Marcus standing on our porch with an expression of determination and anxiety. He asked whether he could come in to discuss the situation with Chelsea and the ongoing community controversy about my property ownership. I need to tell you something that might change how you think about this whole situation, Marcus said once we were settled in the living room. Chelsea didn't just happen to discover your properties through random research. She's been investigating your business activities for months, ever since she started planning her campaign against rental properties. Robert and I exchanged glances, both surprised by this revelation and uncertain about what it meant for our understanding of Chelsea's motivations and methods. Marcus looked uncomfortable but determined to provide information that he felt we needed to know. She started by looking into property ownership patterns in our neighborhood, Marcus continued, but when she found properties owned by Taylor, she became obsessed with figuring out who that person was and why they were maintaining anonymity. He explained that Chelsea had spent weeks researching business registrations, tax records, and property management company relationships. According to Marcus, Chelsea had identified me as Taylor several weeks before our confrontation at the coffee shop, but she had continued her investigation to gather more evidence and build a stronger case for public presentation. Her decision to proceed with the city council meeting hadn't been a reaction to discovering my identity. It had been part of a calculated plan to expose what she viewed as deceptive business practices. She knew exactly who she was attacking when she made that presentation, Marcus said quietly, and she knew that revealing your identity publicly would be more damaging than confronting you privately. His revelation cast Chelsea's entire campaign in a different light, suggesting that her motivations had been more personal and vindictive than she had admitted. The implications of Marcus's information were staggering. Chelsea hadn't been conducting community-minded research that accidentally targeted her mother-in-law. She had deliberately investigated and targeted me while maintaining the pretense that she was fighting against anonymous property owners who didn't care about community wealth. More troubling was the realization that Chelsea's expressions of betrayal and hurt about my deception had been entirely calculated. She had known about my property ownership long before our coffee shop meeting, and her anger about being deceived had been performed rather than genuine. Robert asked Marcus why he was sharing this information now, and what he hoped would result from revealing Chelsea's deception. Marcus admitted that he was struggling with his loyalty to Chelsea, and his recognition that her behavior toward me had been manipulative and unfair. "I can't keep pretending that this was all some misunderstanding," Marcus said. "She targeted you deliberately, and she's been lying to me about her motivations and methods." He looked exhausted and conflicted, clearly grappling with the implications of his wife's actions for their marriage and our family relationships. I asked Marcus what he planned to do with this information, and whether he intended to confront Chelsea about her deception. He admitted that he wasn't sure how to proceed, but he felt that I deserved to know the truth about her campaign and her motivations for pursuing it so aggressively. As Marcus prepared to leave, he made one final revelation that crystallized the full extent of Chelsea's manipulation and plan. "She's been documenting our family's financial struggles and your reluctance to provide more assistance," he said. "I think she's planning to use that information to support her argument that property owners prioritize profits over family wealth." The conversation ended with Marcus apologizing for Chelsea's behavior and expressing hope that our family relationships could eventually recover from the damage that had been done. However, his revelations had fundamentally changed my understanding of the situation and my willingness to continue treating Chelsea's campaign as misguided but well-intentioned community activism. As Robert and I processed Marcus's information that evening, we realized that Chelsea's entire approach to the rental property issue had been shaped by personal grievances and financial frustrations, rather than genuine concern for community wealth. Her campaign against me hadn't been collateral damage in a broader policy crusade. It had been the primary objective from the beginning. The knowledge that Chelsea had deliberately and systematically targeted me while maintaining the pretense of community advocacy was both liberating and infuriating. Liberating because it confirmed that my property management practices hadn't actually created the problems she had described. Infuriating because it revealed the extent to which she had manipulated public opinion and family relationships to pursue personal vendettas. Most significantly, Marcus's revelations suggested that Chelsea's campaign was far from over. If she was planning to use information about our family's financial dynamics to support broader arguments about property owner accountability, then the public controversy was likely to intensify rather than resolve naturally. That night, I lay awake, considering my options for responding to Chelsea's calculated campaign against me. The knowledge that her actions had been deliberate and deceptive changed the ethical calculus of the situation. I was no longer dealing with a misguided family member who deserved patience and understanding. I was dealing with someone who had deliberately targeted me for public humiliation while pretending to pursue community wealth. The question was no longer whether I should defend myself against Chelsea's accusation. The question was how thoroughly I should expose her deception and manipulation, and what consequences I was willing to accept for taking a more aggressive approach to protecting my reputation and business interests. By morning, I had decided that the time for passive response and family diplomacy had ended. Chelsea had declared war on me, using calculated deception and public manipulation. If she wanted to continue that fight, she was about to discover exactly what she was up against. The next morning, I called my attorney, Margaret Sullivan, who had handled my property acquisitions and business affairs for over 15 years. Margaret was known for her sharp mind and direct approach to problem solving, qualities that had served me well in various business dealings. When I explained the situation with Chelsea's campaign and her deliberate targeting of my properties, Margaret's response was immediate and clear. "Debbie, you've been playing defense when you should have been controlling the narrative from the beginning," she said bluntly. "This woman has been conducting what amounts to a defamation campaign against you, and you've been treating it like a family squabble." Margaret's perspective was refreshing after weeks of trying to manage the situation diplomatically. Margaret's first suggestion was that we immediately begin documenting Chelsea's public statements and request copies of all official communications between Chelsea and city department. Under public records laws, these documents would reveal the full extent of her campaign and provide evidence of any false or misleading statements she had made to government officials. Within 2 days, Margaret had obtained copies of all official correspondence between Chelsea and various city departments. The documents revealed a pattern of complaints and requests that went far beyond the maintenance issues she had presented publicly. Chelsea had filed noise complaints about my properties that couldn't be substantiated, requested inspections based on anonymous reports that appeared to have been filed by her, and suggested zoning violations that didn't exist. Most significantly, Chelsea had provided city officials with her own interpretation of rental property regulations, suggesting violations and problems that weren't supported by actual legal standards. Her communications showed a clear pattern of attempting to create official problems for my properties through persistent and often baseless complaints. "This is harassment," Margaret said after reviewing the documentation. "She's been using government agencies as weapons against you, filing complaints she knows are frivolous to create the appearance of legitimate problem." The evidence was more damaging to Chelsea's credibility than I had expected, revealing a level of calculation and manipulation that went beyond mere community activism. Armed with this comprehensive evidence about Chelsea's deceptive campaign, Margaret and I scheduled a meeting with Patricia Hoffman to present our findings and request that the City Council reconsider their approach to rental property policy. Patricia listened carefully as we presented our evidence, occasionally asking questions for clarification, but generally allowing us to make our case without interruption. "This is quite different from what Ms. Williams presented to the council," Patricia said finally. "If your documentation is accurate, it appears that her campaign was based on deliberately misleading information, rather than legitimate community concerns." Her tone was professional but troubled, suggesting that she understood the seriousness of the situation. Patricia promised to share our information with other council members and to ensure that any future policy discussions would be based on comprehensive and accurate information about rental property issues. She also suggested that the council might need to address the broader question of how to handle advocacy campaigns that were based on deliberately misleading information. However, my real triumph came 3 weeks later when I received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. The caller identified herself as Detective Lisa Morrison from the State Financial Crimes Unit, and she had information that made my breath catch in my throat. "Ms. Taylor, we've been investigating Chelsea Williams in connection with a separate fraud case, and we need to discuss your situation with her," Detective Morrison said. "It appears that Williams has been involved in similar harassment campaigns against other property owners, and we believe she may be part of a larger scheme." The detective explained that Chelsea had been working with a group that targeted property owners through coordinated harassment campaigns, with the goal of forcing them to sell their properties at below-market prices to specific buyers. Chelsea's role was to generate community pressure and official scrutiny that would make property ownership so difficult and expensive that owners would be motivated to sell. "Your case helped us identify the pattern," Detective Morrison continued. "Ms. Williams's methods were too sophisticated and systematic to be the work of an amateur community activist. She's been doing this for over 2 years, targeting elderly and small-scale property owners who wouldn't have the resources to fight back effectively." The revelation that Chelsea's campaign against me was part of a larger criminal enterprise was both shocking and vindicating. Everything about her behavior suddenly made sense. The calculated targeting, the systematic documentation, the sophisticated understanding of government processes, and her complete unwillingness to engage in good faith dialogue. Detective Morrison requested that I provide all documentation I had compiled about Chelsea's campaign, explaining that my case was crucial evidence in their broader investigation. Margaret and I met with the detective the following day, turning over comprehensive files that documented every aspect of Chelsea's harassment campaign. "This is exactly what we needed," Detective Morrison said after reviewing our material. Your documentation shows the same pattern we've identified in other cases. Systematic harassment, false complaints to government agencies, and deliberate misinformation designed to create financial pressure on property owners. The detective also revealed that the buyers who ultimately benefited from these forced sales were connected to Chelsea's family through a complex network of shell companies and intermediary business. Chelsea's father's insurance agency had been providing coverage for properties purchased through this scheme, creating a financial incentive for the entire family to participate in the fraud. Ms. Williams wasn't just targeting you because of personal animosity, Detective Morrison explained. She was targeting you because your properties were valuable and you appeared to be vulnerable to pressure. The family conflict was convenient cover for what was actually an organized criminal enterprise. This revelation fundamentally changed my understanding of everything that had happened. Chelsea's behavior toward our family, her campaign against my properties, and even her marriage to Marcus took on new significance when viewed as part of a calculated criminal scheme, rather than personal disputes or community activism. The arrests came 2 weeks later. Chelsea was charged with fraud, conspiracy, filing false police reports, and criminal harassment. Her father was charged with money laundering and insurance fraud. Marcus was not charged, but Detective Morrison explained that he had been unknowingly providing information about my properties and financial situation that Chelsea had used to target me more effectively. When Marcus called me after Chelsea's arrest, his voice was hollow with shock and disbelief. "Mom, I had no idea," he said repeatedly. "She's been using me to get information about you and our family for over 2 years. Everything about our relationship was a lie." The conversation was heartbreaking, as Marcus described, discovering the extent of Chelsea's deception. She had targeted him specifically because he was my son, cultivating their relationship to gain access to information about my properties and financial situation. Their entire marriage had been part of her criminal scheme. "She knew about your properties before we even got engaged," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "She's been planning this from the beginning, and I've been helping her without realizing it." His pain was evident, and I could hear that he was struggling with the realization that nothing about his marriage had been genuine. I tried to comfort Marcus while processing my own shock about the scope of Chelsea's deception. The woman I had known as my difficult daughter-in-law was actually a professional criminal who had infiltrated our family as part of an elaborate fraud scheme. The personal conflicts I had attributed to personality differences and family dynamics were actually calculated manipulations designed to facilitate criminal activity. The trial proceedings unfolded over the following months, revealing the full extent of the criminal network Chelsea had been part of. Prosecutors presented evidence showing that she had targeted over a dozen property owners across 3 counties, using similar methods to generate pressure for below-market sales that benefited her criminal associate. My case was presented as a key example of Chelsea's methods and the sophistication of the criminal scheme. The documentation Margaret and I had compiled provided clear evidence of her systematic harassment campaign and her deliberate use of false information to manipulate government agencies and public opinion. Chelsea's defense attorney attempted to portray her as a misguided community activist who had gotten in over her head, but the evidence of her involvement in multiple similar cases made this argument impossible to sustain. The prosecution demonstrated that she was a skilled and experienced criminal who had specifically targeted vulnerable property owners for financial exploitation. The trial also revealed the extent to which Chelsea had manipulated Marcus and our family relationship. Prosecutors presented evidence showing that she had systematically gathered information about my properties, financial situation, and family dynamics to support her criminal campaign. Phone records and email communications showed that she had been reporting on our family to her criminal associates from the early days of her relationship with Marcus. Most disturbing was the revelation that Chelsea had been planning to escalate her campaign against me if her initial harassment efforts had been unsuccessful. Prosecutors found evidence that she had been preparing to file false complaints with state and federal agencies, potentially triggering investigations that could have resulted in serious legal and financial consequences for me.
When the verdicts were announced, Chelsea was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 4 years in prison plus restitution to her victims. Her father received a similar sentence for his role in the money laundering operation. The judge specifically noted the calculating nature of their crimes and the particular harm caused by targeting elderly property owners and exploiting family relationships. The resolution of the criminal case brought a sense of justice and closure that I hadn't expected. Chelsea's actions had been vindicated as criminal rather than merely inappropriate, and the broader criminal scheme had been exposed and dismantled. My reputation and business interests had been completely restored, and the community's understanding of the situation had been fundamentally corrected. However, the personal healing took much longer. Marcus struggled with depression and anxiety as he processed the extent to which he had been manipulated and used. He filed for divorce immediately after Chelsea's conviction, but the emotional recovery from their relationship required ongoing counseling and support. "I don't know how to trust my own judgment anymore," Marcus told me during one of our conversations, several months after the trial. "If I could be so completely deceived about someone I was married to, how can I ever be sure about anyone else?" His question reflected the deep psychological impact of Chelsea's betrayal, which extended far beyond the immediate criminal activity. Robert and I worked to rebuild our relationship with Marcus, while respecting his need to heal from the trauma of discovering that his marriage had been built on criminal deception. We included him in family activities without pressure and provided emotional support without trying to rush his recovery process. Gradually, Marcus began to understand that Chelsea's deception had been sophisticated and calculated, designed by experienced criminals to exploit normal human trust and affection. Recognizing that he had been the victim of professional manipulation rather than simply a poor judge of character helped him begin to rebuild his confidence and trust in others. The experience also transformed my approach to property ownership and community involvement. I began participating more actively in neighborhood associations and property owner groups, sharing my experience as an example of why transparency and communication were important for building trust between property owners and community. I also established a fund to help other victims of property-related fraud, particularly elderly property owners, who might not have the resources to defend themselves against sophisticated criminal schemes. The fund provided legal assistance, investigation services, and financial support for people who had been targeted by criminals like Chelsea. My properties on Maple Grove Drive became examples of responsible rental property ownership, with regular community meetings and transparent communication about maintenance, tenant screening, and neighborhood involvement. The tenants became advocates for sensible rental property policies that balanced property owner rights with community interests. Most importantly, the experience taught me that protecting family relationships sometimes required confronting difficult truths rather than avoiding conflict. My initial reluctance to challenge Chelsea's campaign had enabled her criminal activity to continue longer than it should have, potentially exposing other property owners to similar victimization. 2 years after Chelsea's conviction, Marcus began dating again, approaching new relationships with appropriate caution, but renewed hope for genuine connection. He had learned valuable lessons about recognizing manipulation and maintaining healthy boundaries, skills that would serve him well in future relationships. The Neighborhood Association for Maple Grove Drive honored me with a Community Service Award for my role in exposing and stopping the criminal scheme that had been targeting local property owners. The ceremony was attended by many of my tenants, neighbors, and city officials who had come to understand the true nature of what had happened. During my acceptance speech, I emphasized that the real victory wasn't in defeating Chelsea's criminal campaign, but in demonstrating that communities could work together to protect vulnerable residents and maintain housing stability through cooperation rather than conflict. The criminals who targeted our neighborhood succeeded temporarily because they exploited our natural desire to avoid confrontation and maintain harmony, I said. The lesson is that protecting our community sometimes requires us to ask difficult questions and challenge information that seems designed to divide us rather than bring us together. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Chelsea's criminal scheme had inadvertently strengthened our community and our family relationships by forcing us to confront important questions about trust, communication, and mutual responsibility. The crisis had revealed both vulnerabilities and strengths that we hadn't previously recognized. Marcus eventually moved back into a rental property in the neighborhood, choosing to rent one of my houses, while he rebuilt his life and decided what he wanted for his future. Living as my tenant gave him a new perspective on the relationship between property owners and residents, and helped him understand why my approach to property management had been so different from Chelsea's characterization. Robert and I renovated our garage into a comfortable workshop space where we could pursue hobbies and projects together, transforming the space that had symbolized my humiliation into a place of creativity and collaboration. The irony wasn't lost on us that the garage where Chelsea had once planned to make me sleep had become a place of joy and productive activity. The experience with Chelsea's criminal campaign taught me that wealth and property ownership came with responsibilities that extended beyond financial management, to include active participation in community welfare and protection of vulnerable residents. I embraced those responsibilities while maintaining the privacy and modesty that had always characterized my approach to business and personal relationships. Most importantly, I learned that standing up for truth and fairness wasn't selfish or vindictive. It was essential for protecting the community values and family relationships that mattered most to me. Chelsea's defeat hadn't just restored my reputation, it had demonstrated that criminal schemes couldn't succeed when communities worked together to support honesty, transparency, and mutual respect. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.